that is presented in order to demonstrate the accuracy of the proposals, the argument.
Okay. First of all, welcome everyone. Special welcome to my parents who came all the way from sunny St. Kitts just to see the baby boy make a presentation. And thank you to the professors. Specifically, Professor Smith, I want to say thank you for stepping in the last minute. I really appreciate that. And you've always had my best interest in mind, and I thank you. I'd like to summarize this dissertation by talking about the theoretical contributions. First, I'll set up the framework, and then I'll answer the question of why do small states survive within the international system. And then I'll explain so by discussing the cases of Lebanon and Cambodia. This dissertation uses structural realist framework to analyze this question using small and micro states as intervening variables. I'll focus on the theory to the counter cases of Lebanon and Cambodia to test these two hypotheses. That if Lebanon and Cambodia are systemically vulnerable relative to more powerful states, then they can transcend bandwagoning by engaging in opportunistic but non-threatening welfare-seeking behavior to develop in order to survive. And the second hypothesis is that if these states do indeed behave in such a manner, great powers are forced to change their grand strategy to compete in like manner for their political support, the support of small states, in this case, led to the civil wars in Lebanon and Cambodia, which actually threatened their survival. So we're going to see deviations in the dependent variable. It worked very well with my first two cases of Armenia and St. Kitts, but they were my ideal types, my cherry-picked, the perfect ideal application. For Lebanon and Cambodia, it didn't work out so well. The methodology that I will use is theory building and case study. Theory building will be used to answer the question, a theory built upon facts and evidence as it presented through chapters 2 through 6. The first assumption, the 5 assumptions each represent a variable. The first assumption is that small states operate within a Waltzian system of anarchy, and they pass the buck by successfully persuading great powers to intervene or assist on their behalf. This is independent variable 1. So beginning with Lebanon, the small state, buck passing security was an essential practice prior to their independence when they were responsible for their internal sovereignty. They imagined, the Lebanese Christians imagined that their country would depend on the French for foreign protection. But because the Muslims did not agree to this, they decided to take on that matter, their external security, themselves. But the idea of outsourcing their security existed in Lebanon many years before the Eisenhower Doctrine of 1957, which the Lebanese depended on to stem the first civil war and to solve that crisis by bringing in American troops to guarantee peace for that country. In the years that followed, the Lebanese executive branch would call upon Syria and then the United States for assistance. In 1978 and 1983, the Christians would play that role by bringing in Israel to protect the Christians in that territory. So, because the Lebanese army were ineffective. In the 1800s, moving on to Cambodia, the situation was very different. Then Cambodia was an independent microstate sandwiched between two much larger and more powerful competing states of Siam and Vietnam, who constantly vied for supremacy in Cambodia to gain advantage over their competitor. To solve this, King Norodom was forced to appeal to the French for protection, and the kingdom had to give up much of its sovereignty to gain this protection. And after independence, Cambodia's dependence turned to the United States, and this was in the context of the Vietnam crisis in the region. And they were worried that, given the domino effect, that Cambodia would be the next state to fall, the next domino to fall to communism, seeing the proximity and overall vulnerability to communism, and the leader, Prince Sihanouk, played upon this fear, gaining millions of dollars in military equipment and aid from the United States. So in both cases, we see these two countries buck-passing their security off to great powers who saw it in their interests to do so. Assumption number 2, and this is the intervening variable. Small states are vulnerable and known by their systemic weakness and lack of autonomy. So this assumption theorizes that both small and microstates are defined by this vulnerability to systemic shock in an economic and environmental terms. These shocks in Lebanon and Cambodia were not so much economic, but they were political and tied to the economy and the smooth functioning or the lack thereof in those countries. So like in many countries in the Middle East, Lebanon really suffers from a lack of inclusive institutions and independent judiciary systems and so forth. And this really hindered the economic process and shifted much of the wealth to the Christians of that country, leaving the Muslims isolated and unsatisfied. So prior to the civil war, we saw the Christians benefiting more from the political system. In Cambodia, the political instability, but tying to the economic performance of the country, was apparent. The survival goals of Cambodia at the time were twofold: to deter domestic communists and defend the borders. But these two were related to economic development. And there were definitely shortcomings because of centralized planning, incompetence, and competing black market. Now this leads to assumption number 3 and part of dependent variable 1. Given...
Excuse me. Do you know how long you've been talking?
10 minutes.
Yeah. Why you
I practiced this, yes.
You're going into way too much detail.
All right, so given the vulnerabilities of Lebanon and Cambodia at the time, we see their foreign policy being defined more by their relationship with outside powers. And Lebanon existed as a country where everyone can do their business, conduct their business, and they resisted cutting ties with the West in 1956 and joining the Six-Day War because they preferred to have positive ties with the West. Cambodia never bandwagoned with anyone either. From their described history, they preferred to associate more with both powers, all three powers, the Soviet Union, Communist China, and the United States, to get aid from all three powers. And they try to sever ties with the United States, but they could, as a form of bandwagoning with China, but that did not work, and it actually exacerbated the economy because of the shocks. That leads us to assumption number 5, in that great powers defend their interests similarly. Coming back to a dependent variable 1, this is now dependent variable 2. So in stark contrast to Armenia and St. Kitts, we have Lebanon, we have Cambodia, and we have great powers trying to get the proxies within the country, Western and Eastern, trying to get more from each side and leaving the other party marginalized. And so the whole aesthetic of the project comes together from assumption 1 to assumption 5, like a beautiful circle that comes together, meeting at the great power behavior. And for that I say, borrowing from Voltaire, it is a privilege to be small, because with no power comes no responsibility. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Why don't we go in the following order? Let's start with Professor Smith, and then Dr. Berning, and I'm going to go last, so Professor Bagley will be the third.